I'm going to be talking about brain development in our 12 to 18-year-olds. In the past, neuroscience ignored the influence of the rest of the body on brain functioning, and medicine ignored the impact of the brain on the body. But now we know that what's happening in the brain impacts the immune, metabolic, autonomic, and neuroendocrine systems in the body. And these systems influence each other and the brain as well. As an example, physical activity improves memory by increasing the number of new neurons in the hippocampus. There's a lot happening in an adolescent's brain as it's being completely remodeled. There are two really important areas of change. One area that happens is in the gray matter, which is made up of all the neurons or nerve cells, and then all the connections between the nerve cells. What happens is that there's more pruning or disappearance of connections between neurons that are not used during the 12 to 18 time period. So instead of having like 500 pathways of different strength, there might only be 50 strong pathways that remain. Those are the ones that are used the most and have become like a well-worn hiking path. This has been happening throughout a child's life to some extent. For example, the visual centers of the brain have already pruned connections that aren't needed during the early childhood period. Different areas of the brain do this at different times, but there's a lot of reorganization and getting rid of connections that aren't needed that happens during adolescence. So there are fewer connections between neurons during and after the teen years. The brain is reducing those connections throughout adolescence, and that process is pretty much finished by the early to mid-20s. The second area of change that happens in a teen's brain happens in the white matter, which is made up of myelin, or the fatty sheath around the end of neurons. And that fatty sheath, or myelin, insulates the end of the neuron, and the neurons that are insulated travel 100 times faster than those that haven't been insulated. As neurons are myelinated, they're able to recover quickly, and then they're ready to fire again faster than when they're not myelinated. Most of this increase is finished pretty much by late adolescence. There are some connections between neurons that form, reform, and change based on new experiences and stressors that teens have. As an example, the cerebral cortex, which is that outer layer of the brain, sort of like the peel of an orange, it's the peel of the brain. That cerebral cortex reduces the amount of gray matter during the same time that the white matter is connecting more and more. So the brain becomes much more efficient, and we see more flexibility in reasoning in our teenagers at around age 15 or so. And then we're also seeing big jumps in their cognitive ability as well. During this time, there's also a lot of change and maturing of the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is responsible for cognitive ability, impulse control, and executive functioning, which includes planning, decision-making, for our teens. And that happens especially during the second half of adolescence. The outer layer of the prefrontal cortex, those outer layer paths become stronger during the second half of adolescence. And those pathways help a teenager to inhibit or stop a behavior. So teens start to have more of an ability to think before they act and not just look at the reward and go for it. There are more connections and more myelination of this area of the brain, and then also more hormone-related changes in the neurons and then their structure as well that end up leading to more effective transmission of information. When we compare teenagers' brains to adults' brains, the prefrontal cortex area is still a little bit less developed in teenagers, And teenagers also use those areas less efficiently, which impacts their ability to plan, resist impulses, make decisions, and use their working memory. So while there are a lot of improvements, there's also more that's going to be done in early adulthood. So don't give up on your teens yet. Their brains are still, in that remodeling phase. The hippocampus, which is responsible for memory recall and retention, is activated more in teenagers compared to adults. And their reward centers, like the striatum and the basal ganglia of the brain, are also highly active, during the teen years. Teenagers are particularly sensitive to rewards, and they have more of a capacity for learning and forming habits when they have positive outcomes as incentives. So that's a good suggestion for us, that when we can focus more on the positive and what things are going well, our teens are much more likely to respond in a positive way back to us. The amygdala, which integrates emotional responses and is really responsive to negative emotions, is highly active during the teen years. The connections between the striatum, hippocampus, and the amygdala that are being formed during this time seem to suppress fear responses in situations where teens might see some sort of reward, like, for example, impressing a girl, being seen as cool with their friends. And this activity, if we think about it, is also adaptive because it might help teens be more successful at making transitions in life, like leaving home for college, starting a new job, doing service activities away from home, and just moving into their own place. This fear suppression is only present in teenagers. Neither kids nor adults show that fear suppression. So it's really interesting that there's just like one time in a teen's life. And, again, the hypothesis is that helps give teenagers the ability to move out and become more independent. So what about adolescent risk-taking, like moving towards sensation-seeking and new experiences, no matter the risks that are involved? The secretion of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that's part of the reward center of the brain, and the efficiency of dopamine pathways from the striatum to the prefrontal cortex increase during this time. And this makes teens more likely to gravitate toward those exciting experiences. Their baseline level of dopamine is lower, but when they do something exciting, dopamine is secreted and they feel good. That might be part of the reason that teens say that everything is boring unless there's something that's pretty exciting happening. They often only focus on the exciting part due to the dopamine secretion, and they may not see the risk part of what they're doing. Or more likely, they might see it, but they may not think that it could actually happen. That's part of that invincibility of teenagers. While we see that executive function skills are improving, risk-taking is also increasing, at least for a minute. The reward centers went out, and over time, teens begin to use their executive function skills more, so they plan and make decisions better than during early adolescence. Every teenager is different in terms of when this happens, but it typically is going to be developed around the second half of adolescence. Remember that everything that is happening in the brain is also happening in the context of what's important for teenagers, which is often increased relationships and importance of friends. So it may be hard for them to think about things that you've talked to them about because they're right there with their friends, or they want to impress a girl. Risk-taking is also partially due to a teen's impulsivity. So, that acting without thinking about consequences, or, their impulsive choices, maybe taking small, immediate rewards over larger and delayed rewards. Impulsive actions are most common in early adolescence, and they're due to the uneven maturation of the circuits between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. Remember that the limbic system is our emotional center in the brain. So these actions are most often seen in teens with self-regulation and executive function issues. Impulsive choices are a little different, and they decrease over time from childhood to adulthood, relating to that ongoing development of the prefrontal cortex. There's a theory that there's a difference in the development of that easily aroused reward system in teens, the dopamine, striatum, and basal ganglia, so that the teens want to move toward sensation seeking. And, the prefrontal cortex, which helps a teen resist temptation. So, it's like there's a push and pull between those two parts of the brain for a while. There was a study with over 5,000 people between the ages of 10 to 30 in 11 countries, and they found a peak of sensation seeking at around age 19, followed by a decrease in 7 out of 11 of those countries. There was also a rise in self-regulation during the teen years, with a peak in the mid-20s in 4 countries and ongoing increases, past the mid-20s in 5 other countries. So essentially, one thing that's happening in the brain during the teen years is the integration of different brain systems. So they begin to work together more effectively, and we see less impulsivity and better decision-making. I'd like to paraphrase Dan Siegel's book, Brainstorm, for a moment, as we look at how adolescence prepares a teenager for adulthood. Not paying attention to the risk involved in a decision can actually help a teen as they begin to make it in the world on their own. Otherwise, they might not ever leave home. And that need for intense social relationships with their peers gives them a little safety as they start to go out a little bit on their own. Seeking out these new experiences can help us as a species to adapt to our ever-changing world. And finally, in terms of sleep, teens' brains have increased neural sensitivity to light in the evening, and these changes in the brain result in a natural desire to go to bed later, even though they still need about 9 hours of sleep. When they get less than 9 hours of sleep and less than 9 hours of sleep consistently, researchers have seen negative impacts on executive function, cognitive skills, and self-regulation.